Good morning, everybody, for another session, another morning discussing the Dreyfus affair. Although we are not French, if we were French, we would recognize that the Dreyfus affair was probably the largest and the most important affair to have hit France and be part and parcel of French modern history. Let us just go back, because everybody all got their sheets with you, which is good. Now, the general background is that Alfred Dreyfus came from a Jewish family living in Alsace. If you look at the second sheet, which is in front of you, where there is a map, and Alsace can be seen to be on that borderline between Germany and France. It was an incredibly sensitive area, fought over many, many times. Once German, up to 1648, and then it became French, and then it would become German, and then it would become French, and today it is French. And this led to the tensions which existed in any border area between one country and another. The Germans looked to Alsace as an area of value for them, and the French looked to Alsace as part and parcel of what they saw as their homeland, and also incredibly important to stave off the advances of Germany. Now, Alfred Dreyfus was a product of that area. He lived in Mulhouse, and we can tell how places changed because it was Mulhausen, the German, to Mulhouse, the French, and the name Dreyfus with a double S became Dreyfus with one S, from the German to the French. But he was always a passionate believer in France and everything that France stood for. And around the world in Europe, France was often looked upon as the ideal country, a country of liberté, fraternité. And it was an area where people would want to actually move to and live. Now, Alfred Dreyfus was a recipient of the admission of, as it says on sheet one, the admission of Jews to the right to citizenship of September 1791. And we have there a family tree, but we won't need to deal with that at the moment. Now, at the same time as living in an area which was extremely successful for the Dreyfus family, he was one of 7 living children. There were 9 of them, 2 died, there were 7. And he and Mathieu were the youngest, and they were the true French. They were the ones who spoke French with a French accent, and their mother tongue was French, not like their elders, who many of them were a mixture of German and French and Alsace and Judeo-Alsatian and a number of different tongues. Now, when they grew up, Mathieu went into the very successful family business. It was in the mills, and he became, as a result, exceedingly wealthy as following on to his hard work and endeavors and very advanced methods of recognizing what was to be done in the world of manufacturing. Dreyfus, Alfred, however, did not want that. Alfred was a slightly strange individual, shy, inhibited, with a very painful, raspy voice. He wasn't of natural for dealing with people. And he wanted to give, as many Jews did, there were some 300 officers, he wanted to give himself to the French army. This was the aim of, they were going to show and prove, as it were, the absolute allegiance to the country in which they lived by joining the army. And Alfred Dreyfus would become not a brilliant officer. He was never top of his class, but he was there and thereabout. And he, all the time, advance through the system. Now let's continue with that moment on Wednesday, October the 31st, 1894, which is where we ended, as it were, last week. Lucy Dreyfus, his wife, a wife of love, sent an urgent telegram to Mathieu at the Mulhouse Cotton Exchange. Said he, or she, he must come to Paris immediately. Now, there were no details. It said nothing else, just come to Paris immediately. Mathieu thought, what can it be? Could be illness, could he have had an accident, but everything that he received as a result of arriving there in Paris was beyond his wildest dreams, that Alfred Dreyfus, the ultimate, the best, the most efficient, the most French of all of the family and within his army, the great belief in the army of France and the democracy, as it were, of France, had been accused of high treason. He couldn't believe it. Now, weeks passed by, and Alfred became associated with the anti-Semitic press. And October the 15th, which was, and if you look at sheet 2, that is La Libre Parole, which was a virulent anti-Semitic rag, and they viewed Jews in a highly negative way. They would be a feeder for what would come a half a century later, or less than half a century later, in Germany. And everything they wrote was of an anti-Semitic nature. There was no difference. On October the 15th, that is 2 weeks before this telegram was sent to Mathieu, Alfred Dreyfus, aged 35 then, was called in for an inspection. Now, that isn't that unusual, he thought, except that he was asked to go in civilian clothes. And he was met by a man from État-Major, the military headquarters, one of whom was and would become infamous, was Commandant Mercier Dupaty. And Dupaty was a particularly unsavory sexual deviant, and that was just his positive parts. And he was a particularly nasty individual. And he was asked, he got Dreyfus in front of him, and he said to Dreyfus, I want you to write down some lines while I'm looking at you. Just write a note on sensitive military matters. Now, Dreyfus was a man of the army. He did what he was told, and he wrote. At that moment, as he was writing, Dupaty placed his hand on Dreyfus's shoulder and called out, quote, I arrest you in the name of the law. You are accused of the crime of high treason. To which Dreyfus said, I am innocent. And he still had no idea what the actual accusation was. He was locked in and he acted, it said, like a madman, banging his head against the walls and screaming and shouting. And he came to the notice of the commandant of the prison, Cherche Midi, a Ferdinand Forzinetti. Now, Forzinetti is a name that you would probably forget, except in the Dreyfus story, he becomes very important because Forzinetti will be the first person who believes that Dreyfus is telling the truth and that he is innocent. And he stood by him all the way the time that he was kept in jail. From his cell, Dreyfus then goes back to an argument he'd had earlier on when he didn't get the marks in one of the exams that he thought he should have got. And he said, my only crime is to have been born a Jew. Now, the Dreyfus family were Jewish. They were assimilated Jewish. They weren't they were certainly not observant in any way. And his brother Mathieu did not marry in a religious atmosphere. His wife then was being interrogated. And Dupaty would come and see his wife, and they would analyze everything which was in the flat where they lived. And Dupaty then exclaimed to Lucy, I put a certain, quote again, I put a certain number of officers likely to have committed the crime. Said Dupaty, this is what I did. I put all the names of all the officers who possibly could have been involved in such a crime of high treason. I put them into a hat and I gradually eliminated all those names that I thought it couldn't be. And I decided that only you, that is, or he, Alfred Dreyfus, could have been guilty. And he said it attracts more and more until finally only one name remains, that of your husband. He is innocent, she cried. And also Mathieu, on meeting Dupaty, refused to believe. You, he said to Dupaty, you are convinced of his guilt. I am not. Now, the press at this moment then went to town, and France began to be riven by those who were at that time not necessarily supporting Dreyfus, but those who were involved in the working of the anti-Semitic press, which is La Libre Parole, which I've just seen, and La Croix, which was the Catholic Church's newspaper, which was virulently also anti-Semitic. He said, or they said, Dreyfus has sold to Germany our mobilization plans. This is what he's done. This is how he committed high treason. Mathieu then said, with a torrent of abuse they were receiving, there is nothing we could do. Then Mathieu would spend the rest of his time, years and years, with the family, defending, with very few friends, defending Dreyfus and working on finding the truth that went on and who was the guilty party, who was guilty of this high treason of which Dreyfus was incorrectly accused. And this would involve often paying, and they had a lot of money, Dreyfus, and there was no end to what they would necessarily pay to get people to reveal. And they were full of charlatans who said they could read the tea leaves or whatever and find out who was guilty. Now, they then came to a solicitor, a lawyer, Maître de Monge. He was a Catholic, an admirer of the army, the very sort of person who would not naturally support Dreyfus. But he was a professional. And even if he was anti-Jewish, and even if he was a supporter of the army, and even if he would take no accusations against the army, he met with Alfred and told the family, if I meet with Alfred and I conclude that he is guilty, I will refuse to take the case, and then the world or France will then know that he is guilty. So you take a risk in having me. But he met with him in Cherche Midi prison, and he said to the family, if Captain Dreyfus was not Jewish, he would not be in prison, and stated that the evidence against Dreyfus was abominable. If there is justice, your brother will be acquitted. There was nothing against him. And then, after much interrogation, eventually the family begins to find out what it is about. And if you look on sheet 3, it is to do with a memorandum known as the Bordereau. This is the most famous memorandum in modern French history for dealing with the Dreyfus affair. It is a document which contains within it 5 military topics, ending with the words, I am off to maneuver. So if you look at the sheet there, you can see it is ripped, and we'll come back to why it is ripped. It was then put together with sellotape at the time. And this was found in a waste bin in the German embassy in Paris, German consulate embassy. And it has 5 things on it about a note. Number 1, on the hydraulic brake of 120, which is meaningful at the time, if not today. A note on the covering of troops, a note on the modification to artillery formations, and a note relating to Madagascar. And then a draft field artillery manual. And finally, it says those famous 7 words, I am going to go on maneuver. And those words would come crashing down onto Dreyfus, because Dreyfus had never been on maneuvers. So it couldn't possibly be him that wrote this piece of material, Bordereau. On December the 19th of that year, there is a court-martial. It is Dreyfus against the army. And Dreyfus was a defender of the army. He would never hear anything said against the army. He had total belief in the French country, the French empire, and the French army. In his defense said, well, the Germans don't even know anything about Dreyfus. How could he be a spy for the Germans? The Germans don't know about him. And one of the general staff stated, but he's an extremely wealthy man. Why would he need to have sold secrets to earn a few francs or whatever at the time in order to turn on his country? Said one of the people, the general staff who were there at the time, he said that famous line, you're right. It would be incomprehensible for others, but he's a Jew. And when it came to Jews, it had already been sold for a number of years, for a decade and more, especially in the anti-Semitic press, that Jews could be spies. They're not the sort of people you could trust. Few wanted to speak, up for Dreyfus. And there were even the Jews who said, get rid of him. This isn't good news for us. We can't live with these sort of accusations or a man who could be a spy. Just get rid of him. But Dreyfus had full confidence in the army, and he believed that he would get off. He would be acquitted because the army was the army of truth. This is France. And in a closed session, which was another thing which was held against those of the Dreyfus side who defended Dreyfus, it was in a closed session, so nobody knew what was going on. Dreyfus was then identified. Somebody, a Commandant Henri, who was an undercover agent and a friend of Dupaty that had accused him all along, came to the trial and pointed his finger at him and said, he is the guilty man. At that moment, all 7 judges found Dreyfus guilty. And Dreyfus listened to the words, today, 22nd of December, 1894, the first court-martial was unanimously declared Captain Alfred Dreyfus of the 14th Artillery Regiment guilty of having delivered to a foreign power confidential documents concerning national defense against France. The court condemns Dreyfus to the punishment of deportation. They no longer had the death penalty, that being removed during the revolution. The court condemned Dreyfus to the punishment of deportation in a fortified place and to military degradation, which we'll come to. According to the Code of Military Justice, Dreyfus would even have to pay the expenses of his own court-martial. Back in jail, Dreyfus again shouted, my only crime is to have been born a Jew. And he wavered at this point between an awful life and suicide. And he signed an appeal against the judgment. The family appealed to Dreyfus and others, do not commit suicide, which he wanted to do at times, for then you will admit your guilt. Fight on, fight on, fight on. New Year's 1894, that's for 1895, the appeal was denied. The only way they would allow him freedom would be if he admitted having written the memorandum, the bordereau, on Friday, January 1895. Postponed to a Saturday from Friday, and some people thought that that was another kick in the teeth of being a Jew. It was degradation was to take place normally on the Friday, but they moved it to a Saturday. None of his family, Dreyfus said to his family, I don't want any of you to be there. None of you should see my degradation. And the only people was a crowd of baying anti-Semites in the main, and among them was Herzl, the founder, of course, of modern Zionism, and Sarah Bernhardt, the famous actress, who believed immediately in Dreyfus's innocence. Herzl, it is said, became a Zionist and a fighter for the emancipation of the Jewish people and their right to a land as a result of the Dreyfus case, and that Jews could never have a place in Europe. That is argued against and not accepted by many who say that Herzl was already a Zionist before the Dreyfus affair, and it merely concreted his views. Then in front of the crowd, he was brought in a black, you can see there are many films on this. One of the best films actually was banned in England. I tried to get hold of it. And it said, Alfred Dreyfus, you are not worthy of bearing arms. In the name of the French people, we degrade you. Dreyfus, dignified soldiers, they are degrading an innocent man. Long live France. Long live the army. He was still an army person. It didn't matter what they did to him. He still believed in the army. With a background of noise, of death, death, death to the Jews, his gold brays from the cap and his uniform, his regimental number, his brass buttons, his belt, his scabbard, the red stripes from his trousers were ripped off of his uniform, and his sword, which had already been heated so it would snap easily, was broken over the knee of the officer. The entire degradation of Dreyfus, the entire awful happening had taken but 10 minutes. He was prisoner number 164, and he firstly went to an island just off the west coast of France, where every day he was strip searched. And in mid-February, he was allowed to meet his wife, Lucy. Lucy wore black. She only ever wore black. For all the 10 years of the Dreyfus case, she only removed her black dresses after he was finally freed. He could only write to his wife, and all letters, whether being received by Dreyfus or sent by Dreyfus, were always censored. Everything was censored. He was sent to one of the Îles du Salut of French Guiana, and Île du Diable, Devil's Island, where lepers were normally kept, where in 1 year under Napoleon III, 2,500 men died of malaria. And this is the island that Dreyfus was sent to, with some books, with some change of clothing, and with his hat. He was not to be spoken to. At no point, as a prisoner, was anyone allowed to speak to him. So not only was he in total silence, he was all alone for year in and year out. And he was in a space, if you can imagine it, where you're sitting in your rooms at this moment, he was in a space which was 4 meters square. For 4 years and a half, he lived only for receiving his wife's letters, of their expression of love one to the other, and his health deteriorated. At times it looked as if he wouldn't survive. Back home, we'll now carry on while Dreyfus is there on Devil's Island. Mathieu did not give up the fight. The family of Dreyfus did not give up the fight, and those who were with and the few supporters they had would not give up. And they would have to keep Dreyfus's name alive. And whilst they would visit politicians and editors and knocked on doors and met with a psychic who would foretell what was going to happen, but Dupaty would not rest either. He would have Mathieu, all his posts examined, he would be followed, he would be bribed, and Mathieu became convinced that the person who really did write the bordereau was the route to justice. If only he could find the person who wrote this memorandum, this bordereau. Mathieu followed all, and he came across and found out about a man we've never heard of, Madame Marie Bastien. Who was she? She was the cleaner in the German embassy in Paris. And she used to go through the rubbish. This is the days before we had means of getting rid of stuff. He or she would go through the rubbish bins in the German embassy while she was cleaning. And anything she found, she would act as a French counterintelligence officer. And she would then hand it over. And one of these were those bits of scraps of paper which were put together with sellotape or the equivalent into this bordereau, where you can see a picture of it. And she handed over the pieces to the Commandant Henri, who we met before. He was the man who identified physically that Dreyfus was guilty and was a friend of Dupaty. Mathieu then traveled to England to get the best of detective. And he discovered more about the bordereau. And he discovered that Dreyfus's name was not there, but there was the letter D. But the country by now was in a situation and divided into Dreyfusards, those who supported Dreyfus, and anti-Dreyfusards, those who were against Dreyfus. The anti-Dreyfusards were mainly those who were in the army, the Catholic Church, and also, of course, the general anti-Semitic press. Lucy appealed to the Pope, and the Pope ignored her. The leader of the Dreyfusards was an unlikely ally, a man, again, you may not have heard of, Lazare Bernard. He was a poet, an independent, anti-capitalist, and an anti-Semite. He didn't like anti-Semitism. He was the very sort of person who you would not have imagined would be fighting at that particular time in that way. But he got attached to the Dreyfusards in order to support them, became a major supporter of Alfred Dreyfus. He attacked many French Jews and said, why are you lying down as it were and not fighting? Why do you have to be as you are? You need to stand up for who you are. And he attacked their victimhood. He encouraged Mathieu to write, and he wrote something known as a judicial error, the truth about the Dreyfus affair, because now it is known worldwide as an affair. At that moment, Le Matin, one of the newspapers of Paris, published a facsimile of the bordereau that had never been seen in public. Mathieu thought, if I want to find the person who wrote it, I'm going to make posters. And he spent a fortune having hundreds of posters of the bordereau made in order to put them up all round Paris and further afield as well. And all of people would be able to see, because he put next to it a copy of Alfred's writing. And if one could see that the writing of the two were not the same. All writing experts, except for those working for the French army, believed that the writing could not have been by Alfred Dreyfus. The vice president of the Senate believed in Alfred's innocence, and he said he could identify the guilty man, that he, the vice president of the Senate at that moment, said, I know who the guilty man is, but my honor prevents me from telling you who it is. But I know who it is, and that's all he would say. And as much as Mathieu asked him, begged him to give him his name, he would not. Then, amongst the number of people that we've never heard of, comes a man, De Castro. We don't even know his first name. De Castro was a worker in the banking field, and he is walking on Place de Madeleine, and he sees the poster, and he recognizes the writing, because he dealt with the person when he was doing financial matters. And then at that moment, he said, I know who that is. And he goes to the Dreyfus family, and he said, I recognize the writing. I recognize the style of the letter Y, the letter G, and others. It is Commandant Marie Charles Ferdinand Volsin Esterhazy. Esterhazy is the guilty man. He is a detestable gambler, crook, and a swindler of Hungarian descent who hates the French, even though he's in the French army. And he said, Esterhazy, the French have not understood me. So much the worse for them. The family became associated with Emile Zola, who hated injustice. He was not a man who was necessary. When you get involved in fields like this, these people aren't necessarily lovers of Jews or lovers of Dreyfus. They are people who are lovers of justice. And Esterhazy was then put on trial. Esterhazy was then put on trial, and because he was now seen as the guilty party, having written the bordereau, that piece of information for the Germans, he was, by the army, acquitted on January the 10th, 1898, and found not guilty, that the writing was we're not going to believe that. And 3 days later, as a result, if you look on the fourth sheet in front of you, there is in law, that is on January the 10th, or then it was January the 13th, 1898, Zola published a letter, one of the most famous letters ever written, J'accuse. And in it, Zola accused the criminal du Paty and the ministers of war and others. He accused numerous people of having been involved in this whole conspiracy to prison or to send him to Devil's Island, an innocent man, only because he was a Jew. But he didn't quite lie down like that, because Zola was himself then found to be guilty of having attacked the state and the army. And he was put on trial as a traitor. Picard, at that moment, who was one of the officers, was dismissed, and Commandant Henri of intelligence who had received a bordereau from the German embassy, who knew the innocence of Dreyfus, who knew who was the guilty party, who had identified Dreyfus in court as being guilty, committed suicide. And Dupaty was retired. At 12:30, we'll end here. At 12:30 on November the 16th, 1898, after having been in prison in silence, in solitude for 4 years, Dreyfus received a telegram from the governor of New Guinea, and that there was to be a revision of judgment. And from Mathieu, he learnt of Esterhazy. Dreyfus wanted, as it were, metaphorically, to tear his hair out. He wanted to, in some ways, smash the head in of Esterhazy, but he wouldn't have ever done that sort of thing. And he still said, Dreyfus still said, I have every confidence in the justice of my country. This is a man who had been incorrectly and unjustly sentenced to 4 years on Devil's Island. And he said, I have confidence in the justice of my country. Noble France it is, and my dear army. And the court said, rescinds and annulled the judgment. Dreyfus ceases to be subjected to the regime of deportation and becomes a simple prisoner to again wear his uniform. But it didn't quite end there. And next week, we will continue on is what happened to Dreyfus, the Dreyfus family, after the events of being removed from deportation. Thank you very much to everybody. Have a very nice day.